Golly gee, are you gents ready for the most thorough review on the internet of Cup Souls Prepare to Die edition? Cuphead is a fascinating game and one that I honestly didn't expect to make such an enormous splash upon release, albeit fueled partially by the baffling incompetence displayed by traditional gaming press. Now, instead of simply being a really fun and inventive 2D platformer developed by a talented studio, Cuphead has become the hard game to beat. It is now a game defined by its difficulty, up to the point that, like with Crash Bandicoot Insane Trilogy before it, some fools have unironically compared Cuphead to Dark Souls, a game which shares virtually no similarities from a design or artistic standpoint. Welcome to Game Criticism in 2017. I hope that meteor isn't far away, but while I am a cynical bastard who probably revels in that fact to an unhealthy degree, I wasn't going to allow the ridiculous gaming journalist-driven controversies to distract me from examining Cuphead thoroughly as its own game. My expectations were quite high for this little game about two brothers repaying a debt to the devil, and those expectations were roundly succeeded. Cuphead is simply one of the most rewarding gameplay experiences of 2017. It's not flawless by any means, but taken as a complete experience, there is a lot to like about this run and gun platformer. You can't really get through a conversation about Cuphead without mentioning the art style at least once, and I think that's a true testament to the quality of the animation and character designs featured in this title. Cuphead's art style is heavily influenced by American cartoons from the 1930s. Yeah, I adore animation, and if I were to rank my favorite styles, this particular school of animation comes in very close second for me, behind only the legendary Chuck Jones directed Looney Tunes cartoons. Studio MDHR set out to create a game that visually echoes the works of cartoonists such as Max Fleischer, and in that respect, Cuphead is excellent. Not only are the character designs distinct and imaginative, but this is simply some of the best 2D animation I've ever seen in a video game, made even more commendable by the fact that it's all rendered at 60 frames per second. You know, that non-filmic frame rate. I can't even begin to imagine how much work was put into every single frame of this game. Almost all of the time, it really feels like you're playing an interactive 1930s cartoon. I love it. Damn near flawless. Bravissimo. The soundtrack is deserving of equally high praise. The score is era appropriate, well composed, and simply exciting to listen to. I honestly can't listen to any of these tracks without a goofy looking grin plastered across my face. Unlike the majority of modern video game music, which is heavily comprised of string instruments, the tracks featured in Cuphead take advantage of reed instruments to great effect. And I'm not just saying that because I'm a saxophone player. No, honest. Does Cuphead have the best aesthetics of any game released this year? Yeah, I think so, honestly. Absolutely exceptional would be the best way to describe it. Unfortunately, I can't say that Cuphead is as technically polished as its visuals. I played the PC version of Cuphead, and during my playtime, I encountered strange, inexplicable performance issues. I know what you're thinking, right? Frame rate drops on a 2D game, the fuck? And to that I say, yeah, it's strange, right? I sometimes found that the game would lock up when I executed a parry slap, which is a move you're gonna use a lot. I know that by design the game pauses very briefly when you land a parry, but I'm talking about instances where the game outright freezes for a second. And when it does, it can lead to some really annoying deaths that wouldn't have occurred otherwise. Perhaps I'm one of the few people to encounter this issue, so I could be wrong, but I figured it was worthwhile to mention. Some of the bugs, on the other hand, are a lot less forgivable. Cuphead is somewhat buggy, which I find fucking baffling. The two major bugs I came across appear to stem stem from glitches in phase transitions for bosses. I can recount one instance where the game straight up broke and I had to alt-tab out of the game and manually close it. There was also another circumstance where I seemingly broke the boss's attack pattern. I don't know how, but it stopped attacking me for the duration of the fight. These were the only major bugs I encountered during my time with Cuphead, but they are unmistakably major and really stick out in an otherwise polished game. But even with that criticism in tow, it's difficult not to be impressed with the work on display here. Visually, Cuphead is one of the most unique games I've ever played, and that is a damn respectable feat. Cuphead can be best described as a side-scrolling run-and-gun boss rush platformer. As Cuphead, or as pal Mugman, players are required to defeat a series of powerful foes and run through traditional platforming stages. As the adventure unfolds through the collection of coins and the completion of mausoleum stages, you're able to access new abilities, projectiles, and super attacks. The core gameplay loop of Cuphead, like most platformers, is quite simple when boiled down to its base mechanics and design. You defeat the boss or complete the level without dying. I know, earth-shattering revelation. While you'll acquire new firing modes and abilities as you progress through the adventure, the challenge ultimately remains the same throughout. It is very much a test of reflexes as opposed to building a more powerful character. It doesn't get any easier, and new abilities are not innately better or worse than those you obtain earlier. I mean, obviously some are better than others, but we'll address that subject later in the critique. Boss battles comprise the majority of stages, and while they're all different, there are some common threads between their design. As you deal damage, every single boss goes through stages where their attacks change or they reposition themselves relative to you or otherwise up the ante. This is assuming you're not playing on simple difficulty, which is simply less engaging and challenging. While engaging in a boss battle, you'll almost certainly have to contend with other smaller hazards or foes simultaneously. In most situations, these smaller hazards come in the form of minor enemies who will roam across the screen or fire projectiles at you, which you will have to dodge while keeping track of the attacks being dealt by the bosses themselves. On expert difficulty, most of the bosses will utilize 2 or more attacks or hazards at once, upping the challenge a good deal and really testing your skills. Trial and error is certainly a part of the experience, which not everybody is gonna like, but I personally prefer that aspect of the game's design. It encourages you to learn from your mistakes and keep track of attack patterns. This naturally results in a game that's quite hard. That's kind of an understatement, actually. Cuphead is very difficult. It's not the fucking Dark Souls of platformers, like that comparison makes any goddamn sense, but weighing against several of its platforming contemporaries, Cuphead is certainly up there alongside the likes of Super Meat Boy. You will die a lot, and you might even get angry. I doubt anybody has finished this game with ease. It's not easy, it's a real challenge. But achieving that victory and conquering a boss who's been throttling you relentlessly is extremely cathartic. This is especially true when you come through a level with an A+ or S rank. The anger and the anguish is always worth it because successfully completing a level or finishing a boss is an actual achievement. Because the game doesn't pull any punches, a win always feels earned. This is a hard game. Some people simply won't be capable of playing it. Personally, I don't see this as a negative or a slight against Cuphead. Video games are interactive, which guarantees a barrier of entry in every title. Demanding a developer to compromise on challenge to accommodate people who simply aren't skilled enough to complete a game is absolutely ridiculous. Difficulty isn't a non-factor that can or should be warped on a whim. It's intrinsic to gameplay, and as such, I see labeling a game as too hard to be a pretty worthless critique, honestly. However, if a game is difficult because it's poorly designed, that's an entirely different matter, and in such cases, criticism is certainly warranted. Fortunately, most of the time, Cuphead comfortably falls into the tough but fair camp. The game presents its mechanics extremely well. From the start, you have a pretty clear understanding of what you can do, and visual cues in the levels will generally provide players with the information they need to avoid taking damage. Pink projectiles can be parried, enemies are taking damage when they're flashing white, attacks are often telegraphed quite clearly. I can only recall a few instances where boss characters didn't display some kind of wind-up for an attack. Every single level can be completed without sustaining damage. Obstacles or attacks may come across as unavoidable, and sometimes you'll be simply screwed, but depending on your placement and ability to read the environment, there's always a way to circumvent or avoid getting struck. Once you complete the game, that becomes the real challenge of Cuphead if you decide to run through it again on expert difficulty to try and get some S ranks. Thankfully, while the odds are heavily stacked against you, bosses never feel like they can sustain too much damage. I mean, at times it'll feel that way, but Cuphead doesn't often venture into the realm of becoming hard because you start making mistakes due to impatience, if you understand what I mean. This isn't a case of faux difficulty, where the enemies can simply withstand more damage. Though Cuphead is quite the achievement in balanced and fair challenge, the difficulty isn't handled perfectly. It's pretty damn good, but I do have a few minor problems. The difficulty curve isn't super consistent, but I'm not exactly sure if that's the game's fault. Some of the bosses I found challenging may have been easy for others to beat, but conversely, the bosses I figure were supposed to be hard came across as not particularly difficult. While many of the bosses on the first island are unmistakably easy, once you reach the second and third island, it becomes a lot more blurred, where some bosses become really easy and some bosses are just insanely difficult. For example, I spent more time fighting that goddamn dragon than I did the two final bosses. The final boss isn't very hard at all, actually. The best explanation I can come up with is that the bosses are difficult based on different metrics. The bosses I struggled with the most were in moving environments with no solid ground, where you really need to have foresight in terms of positioning. Conversely, if the ground was solid and all I had to do was jump or dodge the enemy attacks, it was far less of a roadblock. It likely also depends on what firing modes you have enabled, as they're all functionally different in terms of damage and utility. Speaking of the firing modes, like many games, some of the abilities you acquire over the course of the adventure are plainly too useful not to use. The first super move is the best one, it's the easiest to use, and it deals the most damage. I found the third super move to be borderline unusable. When you use that super, a ghost appears and it moves in the direction you're moving as Cuphead. To me, it doesn't work because it requires you to keep track of and control two independently moving characters to deal damage. Not worth the effort. Similarly, I think once you acquire the charge shot, you're going to have it equipped at all times. Unlike some of the other firing modes like the lobber or the backwards firing shot, the charge shot is useful in the vast majority of situations. In fact, I think only 3 of the 6 firing modes are useful consistently, those being the standard shot, the close range burst shot, and the charge shot. Charms are a little bit better with regards to balancing. Gaining an extra hit point is rather valuable during your first run, though it's likely you'll stick to the teleporting dash once you run through the levels again to get an S rank. Momentary invulnerability of any kind in a game like this is always going to be too advantageous to not have equipped. But as I've repeated ad nausea throughout this critique, the moments of frustration are outweighed by the pure satisfaction this game offers as a gameplay experience. Cuphead belongs to a school of games growing increasingly rare in recent years, only cropping up occasionally with the release of a high-quality indie platformer like Shovel Knight or The End Is Nigh. Cuphead is hard, and it basks in this fact. It presents its challenges to the player and dares you to persist through them. You'll die, and you'll get angry, but if you're like me, you'll keep hitting retry because when you win, you've earned that win. Much praise has been heaped on Cuphead's aesthetics, and rightfully so, because it looks and sounds phenomenal. There is arguably no other game that has so perfectly replicated a distinct art style. It's indisputable that from a visual and audible standpoint, there is no other game like Cuphead. But it's important not to overlook the success of Cuphead as a video game, because the game design on display throughout the experience is equally worthy of praise. It's really easy to blame something else when you fuck up. People often find comfort in the notion that something they failed to achieve was unattainable or that they were unfairly treated and that's why they didn't do well. In the case of video games, some people simply can't tell the difference between a game like Super Meat Boy and I Want to Be the Fucking Guy. The line separating hard and unfair is not nearly as narrow as some would like to believe, and having played so much of a relatively straightforward game, I have to say that Cuphead is challenging but fair. Cuphead is an amazing game, possibly the best example of its genre. It's a difficult game, undeniably, and I imagine certain people will be wholly incapable of actually completing it, but that's good in my opinion. It's refreshing to play a game that's legitimately challenging, and I mean really challenging, intrinsically. Not a game that's unfair or difficult because the enemies have insanely large health bars. It's a game that's designed to stress the player, and the moments of infuriation and rage are always worth it once you finally defeat a formidable foe. The satisfaction that this game offers is almost unrivaled by any game that I've played played this year. It took me 12 hours to complete Cuphead during my first playthrough, which was actually quite longer than I was expecting. Even if you play through it once for $20, I would say that's pretty good value by comparison to a lot of AAA titles. It's a real experience, that I can assure you. Anybody who's grown disillusioned with how easy video games have become in recent years owes it to themselves to play Cuphead. It's the best 2D platformer since Shovel Knight and a potential Game of the Year contender. I, for one, can't wait for Cup Souls 2 Scholar of the First tutorial.